So this is a 24 bay server chassis and it's completely overkill for what I need. I got it anyway. The thing is, I've got a 32U server rack coming and the 3D printed drive bay I'm running right now just isn't going to cut it. So I'm building a full 24 bay NAS from scratch. It's definitely over-engineered for what I need, but that's kind of the point. For context, I'm not a pro. This is just something I've been wanting to build for my home lab for a long time. Anyway, I'll take you through the entire build. You'll see me unbox the chassis, put it all together, get it up and running, and I'll share what's coming next. So let's get into it. Right now, my NAS runs on a drive bay I 3D printed myself, and it can only hold up to 6 drives. It's done a perfect job for a while now, but I've got a server rack coming soon and I wanted something that actually belongs in a rack, with room to grow into down the line. So I went with the Rosewill RSV-H424 server chassis. Was this the most cost efficient option? Definitely not. I could have found something cheaper on eBay, but I wanted something I knew would just work without a bunch of tinkering. It showed up brand new and really well packaged, so unboxing was easy. It came fully loaded with every hard drive tray, the backplane, and all the parts ready to go. It also supports boards all the way up to eATX, so I've got way more room than I'll ever need for the motherboard. The chassis has 24 hot swappable bays, each supporting up to 12 gigabits per second, which means I can pop drives in and out without any hassle, and they've got plenty of bandwidth to work with. Each tray has a sensor light that shows the status of the drive, which also makes it easy to see at a glance which drives are in use and which aren't. On the top left, there's a power button along with 2 other toggles I haven't figured out yet. On the top right, there are 2 USB 3 ports, which is great because I can plug in a USB drive without pulling the chassis out of the rack or reaching around the back. It also comes with 2 handrails that make it easy to slide in and out of place. For cooling, it comes with 3 120mm PWM fans down the middle. They're the thicker 38mm kind, so they move a good amount of air to keep all those drives cool. I was pretty sure these would sound like a Boeing 747 taking off, so I'll probably have to replace them soon. For the motherboard, I went with the Asus Pro WS-W680 ACE, which uses the Intel LGA 1700 socket. This thing is fully decked out. It has 2 PCIe 5.0 slots, DDR5 with ECC memory support, 2 2.5 gigabit LAN ports, 3 M.2 slots, and a bunch of other features. It's honestly way overboard for what a NAS needs, but I wanted something I could repurpose down the line if I ever changed plans. For the CPU, I went with the Intel Core i9-12900K, mainly because I already had it laying around. It's honestly way more than a NAS needs, but it does open up some options. If I ever wanted to run a backup Jellyfin server on here, Intel's QuickSync handles hardware transcoding really well. The one thing I'll keep an eye on is the power draw, since a chip like this can pull a fair bit, and if it's drawing way too much, I might have to swap it for something more efficient. For RAM, I reused 2 32GB sticks I already had for a total of 64GB of DDR5. For cooling, I went with the Noctua NH-D12L, a compact dual air tower cooler that fits well in a chassis like this. I also picked up an LSI 9300 HBA card to connect the motherboard to the chassis backplane. This card supports up to 16 drives through 4 SSF8643 connectors, with each one handling 4 drives. That worked out perfectly because every connector maps cleanly to one of the bays in the chassis. So in theory, it can cover the first 4 rows, so 16 bays total. Down the line, when I want to use more bays, I can add an HBA expansion card to unlock the rest of the chassis. The catch are the cables. I only grabbed 2 SSF8643 to SSF8643 cables, and since each one drives a single row, that means I can run 8 bays for now. The card itself supports 16, I just need more cables to get there, so that's something I'll pick up down the line when I actually need the extra bays. Finally, the power supply, to power the backplane, all the drives, and the motherboard. I went with the Corsair RM1000, it's rated for 1000 watts, it's very well reviewed, and I already own 2 of them with 0 issues. So getting another one for this build was an easy call. So I started by pulling some of the components I'm reusing for the NAS out of a desktop I already have. That's the RAM, the CPU, NVMe SSD, and of course, the drives. This desktop had been acting as my temporary home server ever since my main one had its CPU fail. With all the components ready, I went ahead and I installed them onto the motherboard. The RAM went in first, one stick in the A2 slot and the other in B2 for dual channel. The CPU is always the scariest part, but it went in without a problem. I also moved over the NVMe SSD for my temporary home server, which runs Proxmox with TrueNAS in a VM. For now, this build is going to act as both my NAS and my home server while I get my rack set up. When I thought I was finally done and ready to drop the motherboard into the chassis, I realized I still had to install the CPU cooler. I figured it was going to be a pain since I had to attach a backplate to the motherboard first, but thankfully Noctua's instructions made it really easy to follow. Right before I finished installing the cooler, I made sure to apply some thermal paste. I'd originally bought a tube from Arctic, but the cooler came with Noctua's own paste, so I just used that.
And before I start getting a bunch of comments about how much thermal paste I used, I just want to say that I literally followed Noctua's instructions.
With everything assembled, I was ready to secure the motherboard into the chassis. But then I realized I first had to adjust the standoffs so that they line up with the board. So I sorted that out and then I firmly secured the motherboard in place. This felt like a monumental step, only for me to realize that I had to take the motherboard right back out because I forgot to add the input-output shield. It wasn't strictly necessary, but not adding it would have kept me up at night. So I gathered up some courage, took the motherboard back out, popped the input-output shield in place, and screwed it back into the chassis. By this point, I was already exhausted, and it didn't help that I had a bright idea to do this whole build on top of a cardboard box. So I kept stressing that the chassis would tip over. After a 2-second break, I got back into business, and it was time to connect the backplane connectors to the motherboard. For this task, I was pretty nervous because I wasn't sure what would go where. But after a little chat with Claude, I determined that I had to sit down and read the motherboard manual. So after having the time of my life memorizing the handbook front to back, I knew exactly which connections to make and which ones this motherboard didn't support, which was fine. All the basic connections I needed for the NAS were made and I was finally done with this task. For the next task, I was overjoyed that I had become a handbook expert because it involved connecting the power supply to the motherboard and backplane. For the backplane connection, it was very simple. It was just 2 cables that had 3 Molex connections daisy chained. For the motherboard, this is where my new talent came in, and I deciphered what connections were required, so I did those. Then it was time to play the lovely puzzle called cable management, and I think it turned out decent. The chassis wasn't too cluttered. And with that, the chassis was ready to be fired up, but before I did that, I had to add the drives. So I unscrewed the 3D printed trays off of my drives and I screwed them into the new trays for the chassis. Then with the drives in and the power supply connected, I turned it on and right away I saw the motherboard lights come on and the fans start to spin up. And in that moment I realized I was definitely going to have to replace those fans with something a little more peaceful. Those fans were pulling a serious amount of air, but it's just not going to work since this is going in a server rack in my office and I needed to be somewhat quiet. At this point, I was convinced I had to disconnect the fans because they were driving me insane while I waited for the server to boot. So I did just that and I was thankful I did because the boot process ended up taking some time. Eventually, I made it to the BIOS and was able to confirm that the RAM, CPU, NVMe SSD, and drives were all connected. It was such a relief because I had been worried that something would go wrong. It took a bit, but eventually it booted into Proxmox and I felt a big sense of relief. That meant I'd very likely have my server up and running that night and could keep the downtime to a minimum. Before I popped a bottle of champagne and celebrated, I tried to ping google.com to see if it had network access, and as soon as I saw the host unreachable messages come back, I knew this was going to be a headache. There were a couple of issues. The first was that the network interfaces weren't enabled, which was an easy fix, but after that, I spent the next 45 minutes arguing with Claude, trying to figure out what was going on. It turns out that since I was reusing the same Proxmox instance from another server on my NVMe SSD, it was trying to use the same static IP address as before. The network was blocking the server because the IP was already assigned to a different MAC address. Once I figured that out, I just had the network assign the server a new IP, made it static, and after that I was finally able to reach google.com. After heading over to my PC and seeing I could reach Proxmox, I felt super relieved, especially once I confirmed that all the drives were there and everything had been a success. Woo! Now, an important question: would I recommend this NAS build? Yes and no. It really comes down to your own needs, your constraints, your budget, and your goals for your home lab. Don't take me as the example here. This is way too overkill for what I need, and it's definitely not necessary for what I'm doing, at least not right now. There are so many different ways to build a NAS, each with its own budget, from super affordable setups all the way to very expensive ones. If you're just starting out and don't have much to spend, start with the bare minimum, the computer components, which can be an old laptop or desktop, and a storage solution. If you already have a setup, ask yourself whether you actually need to upgrade and whether you really gain anything from it. If the need is there, then start looking at how you can meet it with the resources that you've got. Now, if you just want to go all out or you actually have a real need for a NAS like this and the resources to back it up, then go for it. The point is, yes, this is really cool, but it's not necessary at all. It's perfectly fine to run a more modest NAS, and there are plenty of advantages to that too. So just pick what makes sense for you right now and don't stress about it. But if you do want to get this NAS, I'll have it linked below along with all the other components I use for this build. It's still too early to tell how well it'll hold up over time, but from what I can see so far, the build quality is high, the backplane works really well, and the inside of the chassis is very customizable. I have no complaints so far, so definitely give it a look if you're interested. Alright, so what's next? This NAS is pretty much complete, but as you can tell, it's more than just a NAS right now. It's acting as my home server and running all of my services. Next up, I'll be building out a 32U server rack, so keep an eye out for that. Once that's up and running, I'll turn this into an actual dedicated NAS running true NAS, along with some other upgrades to fit this whole server rack setup. So there it is. If you enjoyed watching, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss out on the next one. See ya.